Good morning, everyone. It's 11:03, so we will get started. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Leslie Usherwood, and I'm the third generation of owner of my family business, Usherwood Office Technology. Today, we will have about 30 minutes of content for you, and we want to leave the rest of the hour for Q&A. So first, I'll introduce myself and the topic. Again, my name is Leslie Usherwood. I'm the Strategic Technology Consultant for Usherwood Office Technology. In 2020, the world made a shift in the way we work. Offices shut down and employees were working remotely from home. And although we seemingly are back to normal as of 2023, there are still 12.7% of full-time employees working from home, while 28.2% work a hybrid model. And studies also show that by 2025, 32.6 million Americans will be working remote, which equates to about 22% of the workforce. So whether you are currently an employee working remote or a business owner looking to move your company fully remote, we have Nate Hock here and Dan Hernborg to discuss strategies and tips to make your day-to-day more productive and secure. So Dan, why don't you introduce yourself? You're muted, Dan.
Thank you, Leslie. Sorry about that, everybody. My name's Dan Hernborg. I'm a pre-sales engineer with Usherwood Office Technology.
And I am Nate Hock. I am a VCIO here at Usherwood Office Technology as well.
So why don't we just get right into it, thanks. Nate, what are the technology considerations in order to make the leap and have employees work remote?
Great question. Great question to start with, of course. So if you remember back when, lockdown occurred, many organizations found themselves in a situation where they just were not prepared. There was a lot of uncertainty as it was, and around technology, not a lot of organizations had made the investments that were necessary to enable the workforce to go remote. It just wasn't a thing. So there had to be a lot of give and take and working with organizations to try and figure out what would make the most sense. So now, as a result of that, we're seeing a lot more flexibility as a desired, outcome as far as what your users are capable of. So laptops, for example, are more common than desktops. Talk to a lot of organizations, and that's, desktops are all well and good, but laptops are really what's probably the most common thing. Which then brings you to further considerations as far as personal PCs versus corporate owned. How do you keep control over something and keep it secure when it's in an uncontrolled environment, in a home or in another environment even. And then communication, things like headsets, cameras, all that stuff, right? I mean, and those were things we weren't thinking through exactly at the time. And then everybody thought of it at the same time, apparently, right? Because we couldn't find cameras or headsets or any of those things. Docks, oh my God. But then even from a security perspective, things like multi-factor authentication, huge, and then what do you do to protect the endpoints? Like I said, trying to control something in an uncontrolled environment, what can you do? What do you put on an endpoint to keep it secure? Do you have an endpoint detection and response solution? Now that your devices are beyond the corporate firewall, how do you address that? So all of those things became considerations, and some of those things became bridges we had to cross together, as organizations took those steps.
Agreed. So now that we have equipment set up, Dan, walk us through some must-have security considerations for a remote workplace.
Well, first and foremost, and really, really important, is a privately owned asset or a company-owned asset. They are typically equipped with the appropriate security measures and antivirus with encryption and things like that your company provides. Much like Usherwood does, we deploy our own devices out there. You'll hear a lot of overarching technology here, such as multi-factor authentication. Forcing multi-factor authentication on our own devices, using DNS filtering as it's provided by us by our company, and keeping us away from malicious websites and things like that. And some other things to keep in mind. You may also need to maintain the ability to do secure printing with an audit trail when you're working from home by utilizing cloud-based printing applications. And, keeping a list of things that you can do and can't do at work, such as digital faxing. You're able to do digital faxing now, and a lot of people didn't understand how to put that into their workflow.
Yeah. Nate, what are some things to consider when creating remote work policies?
Well, yet again, right, another thing that wasn't really necessarily thought through, but has to kind of, as a result of the evolution of the way the workforce is, has to be thought through. But defining the roles, who can work from home, right? I mean, not even from home, but who can work remotely, I guess is probably a better way to say it, because having a distributed workforce can be very challenging, and not every role is suitable. Some roles have to be present, and so going through which roles make the most sense, and then, be mindful of other considerations. If one of the first things that jumps out at me is compliance, things like HIPAA. Not a lot of people know that remote workers still fall under HIPAA. Just because you're remote doesn't mean that you don't fall under those requirements. So how do you address those requirements? I mean, even recently, having read, news articles that talk about hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines for things like a lost laptop that possessed personal identifiable information. That's a big deal, right? And that's something to think through and consider. So when you have those requirements, that extends out beyond just the confines of your facility or your organization when you have a remote workforce. And then trying to balance that. You think about the requirements, you think about the things like that we've talked about so far, the security, compliance, things like that, but then also balancing that with enablement, because we still want to be able to provide the devices that allow that distributed workforce to get their job done. So, you think through things like we mentioned already, things like PCs, cameras, printers, so they're not using their own personal devices. What about a shredder even, so they could shred documents? It's those kinds of things that you don't necessarily think through, but need to be part of that policy to establish that these are the things that are going to be requirements if that worker or that user is going to be working remote.
Nate, why would you recommend having a company laptop rather than a personal?
All right, I hit mute. Why would I recommend it? So company laptops are something that we have some measure of control over. So when we can put things like endpoint security or just being able to use tools or other things on that laptop, make sure that it's up to date, make sure that from a hardware perspective, it's going to meet the need. Those kinds of things that you have no control over when it comes to a personal device. Not only that, personal devices aren't mostly used just for work. They would also be used for other things. So trying to keep that environment as clean as possible, limited to one person, making sure that no family members are maybe using it, things like that. So those are considerations, of course, that come to mind why you would want, a privately owned versus, or not privately owned, but a company owned versus a personal.
Makes sense. Dan, what are some of the ways of utilizing collaboration and communication tools like Teams, SharePoint, and web-based faxing?
Well, for the glaring obvious reason we're doing right now, we're conducting audio and video meetings with team members, clients, and external participants. So this brought the entire world closer together, like it or not. So some of the policies that we put in place was putting the camera on and getting to know your own company. Using Teams as a central hub for communication, allowing members to chat and share files and collaborate in real time is also really important. We can all edit the same spreadsheet in real time. Multiple team members can work on the same file simultaneously, and you can track all the changes and, of course, leave comments. And then when it all comes down to it, if you need to share these things externally, you're able to do that as well, utilizing the Microsoft Suite. OneDrive allows you to share to external users securely, grant controlled access to allow them to collaborate as well.
Is there any preference on web-based tools versus VPNs?
Well, you need to understand what you need to access. For example, there's a lot of web-based tools, Microsoft 365 being one of them. Many of us have worked with QuickBooks Online, the Google Workspace. These are web-based tools that are available to you and just about anybody. But when we had to pick up our stuff and leave the office, we left behind paper files, sometimes a server full of PDF files, where you still needed to maintain VPN access to get there. A lot of people enabled their remote desktop protocol in sort of an insecure fashion, but when you do VPN properly and utilize your multi-factor authentication, you have access to your files just as if you were sitting on that network. And it really breaks down accessing those things regardless of your physical location. So in a lot of offices day to day, you might end up using them both.
All right, yeah, makes sense. Nate, what can be done about monitoring or ensuring activity and productivity for remote workers?
So this is potentially a sensitive subject, but so one of the first things I always tell folks is no big brother. If you get the reference, great, but not having it's much easier to develop a culture, right, that thrives with that remote access to remote work, rather than trying to utilize a tool that necessarily sees everything that everybody's doing and kind of looks over their shoulder, so to speak, but create a culture where things can be very interactive, where we use cameras, for example. One of the things that we did as a company was when we went distributed, when we had to go work from home back in 2020, um, cameras were a big thing. We had already made investments, significant investments in Microsoft Teams, which was great. Everybody had it. We all had access to it. We had the right tools to utilize it. So going home wasn't so debilitating. We were able to still communicate effectively. We were able to see each other every day. We were able to have daily meetings. We were able to have meetings even as a company where everyone was on the same Teams call, and we were still able to interact and have a great time, get the information that we needed and move forward. And, as a result of all of those things, the company as a whole, we did tremendously well during those time periods. And I think that really played into, like I said, having that interactive nature, being able to keep the team engaged, keep them a part of the conversation. And, then also in the beginning, I mentioned enablement, making sure that they have the right things that they can get the job done. If you provide them the right resources, if you're providing them safe, effective, secure, devices and things to get the job done, and then you are engaging on a regular basis, I would much more advise that path versus trying to find a tool that's going to, like I said, be more like a big brother situation where you're looking over their shoulder.
What about personal cell phones? How do you recommend handling those?
So there's a lot of different things that you can do. There's many tools that can be provided that you can use to make sure that if there is a personal cell phone that's being used for business use, that it's still kept secure and safe. And I would absolutely, those are mobile device management tools. I would absolutely recommend using something like that. Outside of that, if you say, well, what's the alternative? Say we don't have a mobile device management tool. Of course, many companies provide cell phones, right? And that's another way that you can have control over those devices, is to say you will use a company-owned cell phone. We know what it is, we know what's on it, and you keep track of it that way. So again, it's sort of like having that the PC situation. The difference being that we do have some tools that we can use on the phone to make sure that the things that are accessed for business, are kept where they need to, and that the phone is kept up to date and secure.
All right. So we kind of went through that. Oh, wait, we do have a question. So do you guys have anything you want to recap before starting into Q&A?
I'd just like to reiterate that creating a policy, creating a plan, and standardizing it, regardless of it's security-based or culture-based. Working from home doesn't have to be that difficult. Working remotely doesn't have to be that difficult. Nate and Leslie are in Syracuse, New York. I'm coming to you from Connecticut. We work together as a team day to day. Culturally, we put these cameras on when we have a quick conversation. Things like that, and standardization comes to multi-factor authentication. Keep these things, keeping your environment secure goes beyond the four walls of your network, enforcing password policies, and maintaining access control when you're working on your files. All of these things really play into it, goes into culture and security.
Yeah, and to springboard off of that, I would just say, we mentioned it a couple of times throughout, just talking about having control in an uncontrolled environment, as much as possible, for the sake of security, not, encouraging things like, printing personal documentation or client documentation on your home printer and then leaving it on the coffee table kind of a thing, right? There has to be some sort of buy-in too from the user at home, some sort of policies that can be, rolled out to that user base to let them understand that these are the requirements for being a distributed workforce. These are the things that we have to adhere to, and then making sure that they have the tools to do that, right? I mentioned the shredder, which is kind of silly when you think about it, but can be a really important thing that, can keep those kinds of things from happening. Or having PCs, that is an expense, right? Supplying laptops for users to use at home or wherever they are. I keep saying home, but that doesn't necessarily have to be home. Wherever they are, can be an expense, but that's why I think we've seen a lot of the shift to, rather than buying desktops, maybe buying laptops with a docking station, using it, in the dock while you're at the office, but then being able to take it with you wherever you have to go and having that flexibility. There are some users who do that and they never go anywhere, right? They just have that laptop. But in the event that something like 2020 happened again, God forbid, right? They have that flexibility to say, well, I can take this right off my desk now and go home and still be an effective team member. So I think it's considerations like that, owners of companies are going to have to ask themselves what makes the most sense, and hopefully partner with trusted advisors that can kind of walk through what are the pros and cons, what are the things to consider, and maybe ease some of the fear, right? I mean, because there's a lot of fear that kind of came with us from the years past. I've been in the industry a long time, and work from home used to almost, I don't want to say it was demonized, but it was looked at badly. It was like, work from home, we don't want to do that. We don't want to allow that. Well, the world has changed, and a lot of companies are shifting to more of a hybrid model or whatever. The figures you gave in the beginning were really, really on point. So you're seeing that shift. So there are ways to do it, right? And there's ways not to do it. So I just think it comes down to being informed, and making those decisions.
So to kind of bounce off what you said earlier about not just working from home, but working from anywhere, how do you know if you're on a secure Wi-Fi if you're not working in the office or at home? Or even how do you know if your office or home is secure?
You don't.
Yeah, that can be tricky. Certainly, anytime you're in public, I would say treat anything public like it's not secure. If you're at your local Starbucks or you're at the airport, God forbid, those kinds of places are notorious for being very not secure, not safe. So, be very careful when you access those. Maybe use your own mobile hotspot, things like that, so you can kind of keep your communications contained. And when you're at home, some of the things that are going to be useful to you as a remote worker are going to hopefully come from your organization that's providing tools locally to that device that'll try to keep it safe. Not many home users are going to be able to, break into their router and do, I mean, I do know some people that would do that, but, that would go in there and make changes or try to make things more secure. And the ISP certainly isn't going to go out of its way. So I would say, that's where kind of the onus falls on the IT department for your organization, to try to make sure that those devices are secure.
Either of you, have you seen issues with using public Wi-Fi?
Seen personally, no. I mean, I've never run into anything myself, but I have definitely read about them. Lots of issues where it comes to airports were one thing where I always think of airport Wi-Fi, which isn't particularly good for any, as a service necessarily, but they oftentimes, because so many people moving in and out of those spaces, and it just can become very, very dangerous to leave your devices open, to access from anywhere. And that stretches beyond just Wi-Fi. It could be Bluetooth as well. But, just making sure that you're mindful about what your device is connecting to. And, like I said, that those tools are in place to keep it protected is really going to be, the way you're going to be able to keep yourself safe.
Mm-hmm. So kind of jump back into security monitoring. Is there any proactive security monitoring things you can do if your workforce is hybrid? If either of you want to take that one.
So not to keep jumping in, Dan, I apologize. So to
That's okay.
being proactive when you're working a hybrid, and you mean as an organization?
Mhm.
So I think, again, not to continue to be a broken record, but when we start talking about what can we do if we're thinking about moving to a work or a hybrid model or a work from home model, I think it's going to be control what you can, and being mindful about the devices that are going to be used, the job that's going to be performed even. Are you going to allow people to print stuff from their house? And if so, how do you handle that? Are you going to provide a printer? Or are you going to have them print stuff to the office? And what is the technology necessary for that? There are certainly ways that can be set up, that printing can be done at the office. Or is printing even if something you want to do, period? I mean, are you going to work within digital documentation and collaborate that way? All of those things just need to be thought through. And I think some of those bridges will be bridges you cross later, just out of necessity as you go. But yeah, definitely on the front end, from a security perspective, control everything that you can, from keeping the devices safe, from keeping the data safe. And then, rely on your workers to be empowered and enabled to be productive. And then just keeping in contact with them so that you can make sure that those things are, being adhered to, even if that means regular training, for example, or things that you can do to remind them that, hey, there are requirements or there are restrictions, or maybe you do fall under HIPAA, or maybe you don't. Maybe you just, want to be safe like everybody, right? Here are the things that we do require as an organization, and you're going to have that reminder. You're going to, have to read through it, have to sign off on it, whatever that means. You as an organization will have to come together for that, to put together that policy and decide what makes the most sense moving forward.
Mhm. Definitely. So I think that kind of concludes. If there's any last um, thoughts from either of you, and if not, we can open questions from participants in the Q&A. So if you do have a question, feel free to write it in the chat. We do have one. In your opinion, what is the most essential, efficient, and productive factor for creating a successful remote work environment?
Utilizing all the tools afforded to you and utilizing them well, closing the consumption gap. A lot of people, when we had first work from home, everybody had Zoom and Teams. Some people even had Google Meets, whatever the case might be. Pick one, utilize it fully, like we do with Teams and SharePoint and the Microsoft suite. I feel that's really essential to be the most efficient, is just utilize the tools afforded to you and use the very best tools that you can afford.
Yeah, well said. Perfect.
So how do you handle issues with Duo pushes or MFA when working remotely?
So Duo can be handled in a couple of different methods. There's a native application so that when you attempt to log in, it will ding your phone. If you're using a bring your own device policy for somebody who doesn't want to put an unknown app on a phone that they own, Duo has the ability to call you, and you can simply answer the phone. So there's a number of different ways to manage multi-factor authentication regardless of where you are.